Welcome to another edition of the Inspired Stories podcast, where leaders share their experiences so we can learn from their successes and be inspired by how they've overcome adversity. My name is Anthony Codispoti, and today's guest is Rob Carskadden, partner at Three Rivers Capital. They were founded in 2005, and they're based in Pittsburgh. They focus on buying and recapitalizing small private companies. Their mission is to remove barriers to growth for family and entrepreneur-owned businesses, helping them reach the next level. Rob co-founded Three Rivers Capital and has led numerous initiatives to transform these companies using his 12 years of operational finance experience. Before launching the company, he was a partner at Standish Consulting and held finance roles at Ford Motor Company, refining his skills in process analysis and strategic decision-making. Under his leadership, Three Rivers Capital has gained a solid reputation for its hands-on approach and long-term growth mindset. Rob's dedication to helping entrepreneurs thrive has made him a respected figure in the private equity space. Now, before we get into all that good stuff today, our episode is brought to you by my company, Add Back Benefits Agency, where we offer very specific and unique employee benefits that are both great for your team and fiscally optimized for your bottom line. One recent client was able to add over $900 per employee per year in extra cash flow by implementing one of our innovative programs. Results vary for each company, and some organizations may not be eligible. To find out if your company qualifies, contact us today at addbackbenefits.com. All right, back to our guest today, co-founder, managing partner of Three Rivers Capital. Rob, I appreciate you making the time to share your story today.
Well, thanks for having me, Anthony. I appreciate it.
Okay, so before you found your way to Three Rivers Capital, you worked in finance at some pretty large companies, including Ford and Thermo Scientific. Specifically, what kind of work were you doing, and how did it lay the foundation for the work that you're doing now?
Well, it's interesting because, I graduated from Columbia Business School, and that role, my thought process was I going back to Wall Street, because I was on Wall Street prior to going to business school. And I really thought to myself, I didn't really want to go that path. I really wanted to get my hands dirty in industry and really learn about industry. And I also wanted to get out of New York. So I was at Columbia Business School. So I said, hey, it's time. I wanted to have a family. Let's get out of New York. And so Ford had this program. It was called the Career Foundation Development Program. And what I really liked about it was a rotational program. It wasn't primarily finance. It was finance driven, but it was really kind of getting an opportunity for people like me to get the experience on the floor, material handling, production. One of my roles at Ford Motor Company is I was a production, line guy for the launch of, it was 1994, the new launch of the Mustang. And I was on a fender line in the whole, steel, it was a steel plant. So it was a stamping plant for the fender program. So I had 8 guys on the line. And I was college.
So you were working on the factory floor?
I was working on the factory floor.
Okay.
And we were in basically job one. It was the first year. So as you can imagine, on job one at Ford Motor Company, we had new KUKA robots. We had new equipment. And so you're basically, as everyone says, buying that first year car is really maybe not the first model year car is very difficult, right? Well, we had 8 guys on the line. And I had to hit about 400 units a day. And I never forget this. It was the hardest job I ever had. We were working 12-hour days. I was on my feet. But I really kind of learned a lot about kind of what it meant for these people to work. Quite frankly, I understand how difficult. I mean, there are people that work 30 years doing that kind of job. And I was never, ever so tired in my life. But
hard physical labor, huh?
It was hard physical labor. You're on your feet. And again, we were doing overtime. It was, trying to get everything to work properly. But it taught me a little bit about kind of the difference between, real labor and kind of where I was going with my career, right? So, I started in that regard. I worked in the controller's office. I worked in product development. So fortunately in that era, it was the rotational program, but I got to see a lot of the different elements of manufacturing and what goes into it. When you think about, I worked on the program, it was called the FN program. It was the small market transmission program. And it was pre-job one. We were working with Mazda Mazda was at the time, I think Ford owned 30% of Mazda at the time. So it was a joint development. So they would come from Japan and we would work through the engineering, and then I would be working on the costing. So long and short of it was, very interesting job, had multiple roles at that time and learned a lot about really what it means to make a product.
Yeah. So you had a lot of hands-on experience. You were right there on the floor. You were seeing things up close. I'm curious, kind of fast forward, because I really want to talk most of our time here about what you're doing at Three Rivers Capital. You co-founded this firm. Tell me about how you met your partner and what was the inspiration behind starting this?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I was consulting at the time. So I was doing an activity-based costing implementation for the Robert Bosch Corporation at the time here.
What does that mean?
It's kind of like a buzzword, but at the time, but it really is it's a form of cost accounting where you're trying to determine the real cost of delivering something or a service or a product. And so, those products, the cost that goes into those products, there are activities that go into that. And those activities basically are allocated, to that particular product or service. And those activities themselves have drivers to those activities. And therefore, there's a cost to that activity. So you can allocate that cost of that activity to get it, to the final delivery of that product or service. And so there's a lot of like analysis and mapping, time studies, things like that you do. And so that you can say, all right, it really is helpful, obviously, in some services. So, you may, have an engineer that has to do X, Y, and Z. And so I have to spend time doing this. I spend time doing this. How do I allocate my time to this particular product? What am I doing? It's basically a fancy way of talking about a more, I'd say, detailed cost accounting.
Okay. So that's what you were doing at the time. And then the idea and the meeting up with your partner, how did that come about?
Well, it was a mutual friend. I met Dale Buckwalter, who, by the way, everything I'm talking about today, about my firm and all that, all kudos to him, because everything I'm talking about, he had a big major role in all of this. But that being said, we met in, I think it was around 2003, 2004 timeframe. And mutual friend, and he was in a transition as well. He was looking at, I had the freedom because I was doing my own thing, enjoying, for the first time in my life, actually making money based on what I was delivering. So it was really it was interesting foray into understanding what entrepreneurship's about, because, I'm getting paid for the value and service I'm doing. And I was kind of really learning a lot about that aspect of it. But in the process, I met Dale. Dale was also looking to, I think his job, he was going to have to move to Tampa. His kids were in Pittsburgh. He didn't want to move. We had talked about, this idea of a private equity firm. And then, really what happened was, we felt like, as we talked, we felt like there was this need in the market. Now, this is back in 2004. I think the world's changed since then. But, there are all of these companies that are owned by people who are over 55 years of age throughout the entire Rust Belt area. And that's where we looked at in the beginning. And I think we did some analysis, said east of the Mississippi, 350,000 companies, under 50 million of revenue that were owned by owners that were 55 years and older. So what were they going to do with their businesses, right? Most of these individuals, most of their net worth was kind of locked up, say, in these companies. And they didn't have transition plans. Some
didn't necessarily have family members that wanted to come and take over the business.
Yeah, and if you think about the time frame, right, this is right past the late 90s and the dot-com boom and everything else. And I think a lot of the children and people coming up in that era were like, do I want to work in my dad's or my mom's or my family's factory? I want to go work for Google, or I want to work for eBay, or whatever it may be.
Factory jobs weren't sexy. I'm going to go get a high-paying white-collar job. Yep.
And I think that transition. So, a lot of I'd say the boomer era of owning businesses. So, we saw this huge opportunity set. On the other side of the coin, there really weren't any real private equity or institutional money working in this environment. Now, it seems crazy today.
That is surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now everybody's doing it, right?
Everyone's doing it. But at that time, there weren't. So what does that mean? High demand meaning, I should say high demand from people who want to sell their business, but let's just flip that for a moment and say a supply of all these companies that are out there that need, that someone out there that can help them, transition their businesses, but really not a lot of private equity involved, right? At all. And so,
what was PE focused on at the time? Was it still, it was tech, right?
Well, it was tech and it was larger,
Okay.
Again.
Got it. This was too small for most people's radar.
Yeah. Think about a high margin. It's kind of like a higher margin business, the higher up you go, right? Bigger fees, bigger, put more money to work. The other side of the coin is in these kind of businesses, and we can talk about this a little bit later, but these kind of businesses really, private equity kind of came in to say, they're buying these companies and they're moving these companies forward in a way that maybe is a little bit easier as you're at the larger scale than you are at the smaller scale, right? The smaller scale businesses, they're usually not really prepared for the way the private equity industry was at the time. They weren't scalable. There were a lot of these issues that they had, whether it was IT infrastructure, management science alike. So, the idea is that these were hard deals to do. And they were hard deals not only just to actually get done, these were deals that you had to roll up your sleeves and really get involved with the companies. You weren't just buying a company and saying, all right, I got this platform. Now I'm going to go out and find, 5 or 6 other companies to roll into this and to drive this into a larger market, which is a lot of what private equity did and still does today, or they still do today. This was more of like, all right, you have to come in and really transform a business from the ground up, basically foundational.
Okay. Say more about the team that you've got there at Three Rivers Capital. Is it primarily just you? You're like super small shop, or you have some folks that are helping out?
Yeah, no, we do. We've changed over the years, right? In the beginning, it was just myself, Dale, and we had another partner, Bob McGuire, at the time, and an assistant. And we did all of that work. We did everything ourselves. We sourced, we modeled, we did all of it. Over the years now, we have two deal people. We have another partner who's just got promoted, partner Michael Zong, who drives our transaction group. We have a significant back office, I would say, and that really had to morph because of just the fact that today we have 8 companies in our portfolio. So, we have basically a controller, we have 2 deal people, I have an ops manager, and then we also have a whole group of people, operating partners that work for us that we have, located with our companies. So, we're about a 7-person shop today. Again, what we do is, primarily we're quarterbacks. That's what we do. Generally speaking, we have a lot of vendors and a lot of partners, that we've developed over 20 years that support us in all different aspects of it. But our team is really focused on, portfolio management, which is really where we built our firm up. Transaction side of it, we've been doing it for 20 years. We can crank out transactions left and right. We're pretty good at that.
So help me understand, when you guys go into an opportunity, are you buying 100% of the company? Are you taking majority stake? Are you taking over operational control?
We do controlling interest, meaning we have over a 51% ownership. In most cases, we have, the vast majority ownership. More often than not, a lot of times our owners will roll over and join us in the journey. We always call it the second bite of the apple. They get a payday when we buy the business, and they have an opportunity to run with us to get that second bite.
And so they stay on board and they're helping from an operational aspect as well?
Yeah, and sometimes they stay on for the duration. Sometimes they'll stay on for 6 months. Sometimes they'll invest, a significant amount, sometimes a little. And then sometimes they don't. But for the most part, what we do is we go in, we take a controlling interest. We also give, at least 10 to 15% of the company we set aside for our employees and our management team. So they have what we call profits interest. So, we're never 100%. At the very least, the employees and or, the operating team, has some equity in the business.
And so a lot of times, as part of the transition, you're finding your own operator to kind of put in place there, or maybe promoting from within, if it makes sense.
Both. Yeah. And that's part of the diligence, right? We talk about, when you do deals in this space, I think the one thing that 20 years of experience has taught us is, when you're buying these companies, again, they're either family-owned businesses or entrepreneur-led, owner-led. It's a very emotional decision for them. And I think sometimes, and I think this is kind of the issue sometimes with a lot more, we have a lot more players coming into our space now, right? And we have over the 20 years, primarily because people are seeing the opportunity. But, when you come into the space, you have to really understand there's some nuances to this that are different than what I would say at the next level up in private equity. And that is understanding that emotional impact, there's a human element to this is a little bit more delicate. And so, when we go in, we have to, navigate that. And that really kind of plays into how we think about transitioning the businesses too, right? Because, these are good businesses, right? We go in, we're buying good businesses. They have to have tailwinds. They have to be in markets that we're interested in, all the basic underwriting that you would expect. But yet, there are clearly some low-hanging fruit and things that they aren't doing, right? That we see that what can we do to help make them scale? What's holding them back? And in many ways, most owners, no one's going to know. We always tell this to the owners too. No one's going to know your business better than you do, including us. We're going to come in. We can do all the work in the world. I know a lot of people in our industry think they're really smart, and I'm sure they are. But no one really understands their business the way that entrepreneur who built that business does. So that partnership is critical. But really where that partnership works and where you have to understand is you can't change what made the magic to begin with. You have to understand.
You don't want to upset the apple cart. You got a good thing going. But what are actually, can you give a specific example of low-hanging fruit? You went into company X and they were doing this one way or they weren't doing it at all, and you guys were able to put something in place that really helped to accelerate that growth.
I mean, there's a whole multitude of things. Most companies at this level, something pretty basic, like the biggest value creator of all in these companies is organic growth, right? So if you think about us, we buy businesses from 3 to 10 million of EBITDA in that space. And so literally, I would say take sales processes. Many of these companies, if you think about it, right, if they're especially entrepreneur-led or owner-led, right, they are primarily the salesperson for these companies. They're the ones that started. They're the ones that had the vision. They're the ones that knew it. They're the ones that went out and really pumped it to build that business. And what we often find is that piece of it is always lacking. The importance of building a good, tight sales process, because it never really needed it. The individual was able to drive and grow that business. Oftentimes that business is started by that keystone account that really gets them in business, right? Find that one major account that gets you launched, right? And then therefore, in many cases in our businesses, there's some customer concentration for that reason, right?
Which is risk.
Yep. So that sales process is critical to de-risk it, right? And also to really accelerate the growth. And that's often low-hanging fruit. I'd say secondly, we'll find that strategic planning, some basic management science, I call it, right? It's IT infrastructure. How do you scale, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, in today's world, you have to have a fairly, sophisticated tech stack to really, really, drive value. They have their tech stack. They may have something they built.
And sorry, Rob, when you talk about tech stack, what, like, I mean,
ERP system.
ERP,
like an ERP system, say, or maybe, just, your basic CRM,
which goes into the sales processes that you were talking about that you need to put in place.
Exactly. And many times they may have, holes in their organizational structure. And what's really interesting is, I call this stuff foundational in a way. What's interesting about some of these things is that's what's great about these businesses. The impact you can have, by doing these really basic foundational things on the growth of these companies can be fairly substantial.
Things that you guys have done over and over again. So you've kind of got the playbook for. It may not be, common knowledge to the businesses that you're acquiring, And that's why it's such a good sort of relationship there, is you guys have that expertise to bring in, put that foundational stuff in place that you've seen work again and again and again. And you can see some results from it pretty quickly.
Well, think about it this way. If I started a business, and let's say I was in my late 20s and I started my business, started building it. Now I'm in my 30s, 40s, 50s. You start getting into that realm. You spent your whole career in that business. Your aperture is fairly, probably, you know your business really well, but you haven't really experienced a lot of other things outside of your business. I think what's really interesting about this is where the partnership comes in, right? You have the expertise and the domain expertise and knowledge of that entrepreneur or that owner or that family who's been there for years and years and years. But you open up that aperture of thought that maybe they haven't seen before, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, we've owned dozens of companies. We've been through multiple cycles. We've been through the Great Recession, COVID, all the above, right? We've seen supply chain issues. We've seen inflation. We've seen all this. We've had to navigate companies through some of this, and they've had to navigate themselves, and they figured it out as well, right? If they've been around for that long. But the point is that, over the years, what we do is we bring different perspectives. We bring opportunity. We bring different thinking, and also different, I would say a whole laundry list, I would say, of relationships and service providers that can really be helpful. So, it's really that partnership, when it works, that partnership can keep the magic of the company and open it up, to greater. Just let's go back to the moment for like strategic planning. One of the real basic things I think a lot of companies at this level don't do. Think about the map of your market and service, right? And you say, all right, I'm in a company that provides, we have a company now in wound care, right? And you say to yourself, all right, what are we servicing the market? Does our service map really cover the whole range of of opportunities that we see? What are those opportunities? What are some of the technologies coming down the path that we should be thinking about? Should we be getting into some of those, right? So there, I think there's some level of strategic thinking and thought that brings into play. There's frameworks, right? I always say some of them I think are kind of silly. Some people think, oh, it's just another business school framework, whatever. But I do think some of these frameworks are important because they're communication tools, and communication is always probably the critical. I always say, business in many ways is just an amalgam of conversations, right?
I want to go back to something you said a little bit ago about sort of the human element of the transition, because I think this is really important. And you were saying as much, but I want to explore it a little bit more. Something I've gone through in exiting businesses, something I've seen a lot of my peers, my friends go through as well, is an exit seems very exciting when you're on this side of it. As you get closer to it and sort of the realization of this big life transition settles in, question marks start to come up. As you get on the other side of it and the day-to-day of your life has now significantly changed, then it becomes really destabilizing. Like part of your identity has kind of been yanked from you. This is been a big part of the reason I got out of bed every morning for years and years and years. I go in, I meet with my team, I make decisions, I put out fires, I meet clients. Now what do I do with myself? Now where do I fit in? I'm guessing you have seen this up close and personal multiple times. How have you either been able to help folks through that or seen people kind of manage that process on their own to kind of find that new way in life?
That is an excellent observation and good question. And I would say that is definitely true. I mean, you'll even have, there are people who are in their 80s that may go to the office. They're the owners. They may not even be that involved in the business anymore, but they go in for 4 hours a day to say hi to everybody, have their coffee, and it's part of their life, right? It's a difficult thing because there really is probably no real good answer for that from our perspective on how someone transitions that. Because at some point, either they're there or they're not, and if they're not, there's not much we can do about it. But I would say that it's important that they understand that their company is in good hands. right? I mean, the best you can do, in that regard is let them know that, hey, we have you covered. We're going to take good care of what we would consider your baby. And, and that really happens through the process before we sell it or before we buy the business, right?
Yeah.
And so the communication and the alignment is important. And I always tell people when they're trying to sell their business, our industry is full, it's a bell curve. I mean, there's going to be some great firms and not so good firms and in the middle, right? Who you choose as your partner is critical. And that evaluation of your partner up front in terms of who they are, what their approach is. And one of the, I think, benefits we get from being around so long is we have a lot of references, right, for what we do. But, it's that communication up front and that alignment of like our vision for what we want to do with the company and making sure that alignment is there with them and us. Now, we may not see eye to eye on everything, right? Some of the things that we want to do, they haven't done. They haven't maybe thought about it or, but for the most part, it's more, what, are you going to shut down my business and consolidate it somewhere else? Well, I don't want to sell it, right? Are you going to fire half of my employees and do this X, Y, and Z? Well, I may not want to sell to you, right? Because let's think about it. Most of these companies, those employees are like family to them, right?
Yeah.
They may be going to the club with some of them, playing golf, and I know their kids. And, a lot of these companies are in smaller towns where everyone knows each other, right? So, that communication up front and that alignment of vision is really, I think, the best you can do. And then when it comes to the other side, sometimes actually more often than not, from what I just said earlier, these people do have a lot of domain expertise. One of the things that you'll find happen is they'll sit on the board. You still have a board seat. You still have access. You still can be involved in some way.
They still have their feet wet in the business. Yeah. That means a lot to them.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I think probably happens more often than not. And we welcome it because they have that expertise and knowledge. We don't want that to leave.
So I want to hear a little bit more about what specifically you look for in a business. I mean, you've already mentioned kind of the EBITDA range, 3 million to 10 million annually. What kind of markets do you guys like in terms of industries? What kind of geographies are best for you? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed over the years, right? I mean, again, after 2 decades, things kind of move. But one of the things that we really focus on is one is size, as you mentioned. I think the other side is, we've done, I think, 19 white papers. We started in 2015 and honing in on thematics. But we like to stay a little bit flexible because we believe, right, and we've seen it every day, is the world changes fairly dramatically. So getting too honed in one area or another, especially over 20 years, doesn't make any sense. I mean, we were in oil and gas in the mid, like 2013, 14, and 15. We're not doing that today. But our thematics about, 2015, we looked at it from the perspective of what are the great factors of influence that we see that we think are going to be relevant for at least a decade. And it's kind of funny because it remains to be true. We had, escalating global conflict, go figure, right? We had the transformation of our, basically our energy situation and grid. We also talked about demographics, right? And the demographic change that were happening. So the big picture. And then finally we talked about basically, what I would consider it's essentially the transformation and digitization of the industries going forward. So if you think about that from the perspective of industrial automation or Internet of Things, we see it. Those were the trends that we looked at, and then from there we drilled down to manifestations, and and we wrote about those, and then we drilled down into what we would consider sub-vertical markets that we think are attractive. Those sub-verticals may change year over year.
What do they look like now for you?
Well, right now, we've been kind of moving, and we have for a few years, into the healthcare services side of the coin. We have quite a few of those. and I would say industrial automation. Those are the two that really are very interesting to us. And I'll give you, so if you think about, you start, like I said earlier about the, demographics, right? And you roll down and you have the change with millennials. Now you have the change with Gen Z. And now you have, the retirement, obviously, of the baby boomers and maybe even some Gen Xers now, right? And so, we saw, like everybody else, obviously healthcare and healthcare services consumption was going up. But the question was, where do you want to play? So when we talk about the subvertical, right, we looked at, we want to play in a segment of the market that basically reduces the cost curve, right, in the industry itself, right, and we want to, and it has measurement of improving outcomes, right, and also that you can actually service, meaning, who are the employees that you're going to need to hire to service this industry. Right? Those are all critical factors. And I'll give you an example. So we did, about 15 years ago, we launched into, it wasn't 15, maybe a little bit less, but we went into physical therapy. And where did that make sense at the time? Well, that made sense because physical therapy was a cheaper alternative, right, to going straight to orthopedic and getting surgery. We felt like, there were good outcomes in physical therapy. People were getting healed, right? And, there were plenty of physical therapists to hire and there are people out there, right? Now, we moved into pediatric home healthcare. That was another industry we got into. And what did that mean? Well, these are
specifically pediatric home healthcare?
Pediatric home healthcare. So it's private duty nursing. So in that example, right, you have children who need 24/7 care. They're catastrophic situations. They're basically in children's hospital. So what happens is the cost differential of being in children's hospital versus being home is significant. So you're bending that cost curve down. You're bringing those children home to their families. And that personal care that they get, because these nurses that work in this industry are just saints. And they have that really good, relationship with those children and that family. So the level of service is better. It's more personal. And so that was an area which that's another example of kind of going down to that subvertical and why we chose that.
Apologies if you already mentioned this, but what's the term of your fund? Are you guys kind of 7 to 8 year, 10-year hold, or is this like a buy and build and like just you guys?
It depends. I mean, we're not much different in terms of we've had I think 3 exits that we've owned the company with it for 3 years. Right?
Okay.
I think we have some right now we've owned for 6 or 7, and all in between. I mean, we're not under the gun necessarily to, we feel like it's a little bit of a longer cycle, I think, in what we do because of what I said earlier about the foundational, investments you need to make to start to scale. I'd say the first year and a half, you're really trying to put all those foundational elements together. You are growing the business. You're doing the best you can. But for example, in that pediatric home healthcare business, we grew top line by 35%, but EBITDA was flat. And the reason that was the case was because we probably spent $1.5 million in year one, compliance, right? How do we upgrade compliance? What are we doing in our recruiting structure? How are we, so as you put that SG&A to build that scale, what kind of system do we need to put into place? So you have, your healthcare systems and your ERP and all that stuff. All those foundational investments that take time and effort, you're just not coming out of the gates right away and doing it at the same speed. And quite frankly, we're not even thinking about, say, add-on acquisitions or anything else until those foundational elements are handled.
Rob, I'd be curious to hear a specific example, like an actual case study, if you can mention the company's name even better, where your finance experience in particular directly influenced the direction or the success of one of your companies.
I would say it's interesting. Finance is a broad term. I would say when we think about it, I would say the impact, finance is not real difficult. The real area where finance helps them would be obviously the capital structure that we put into place to give them the liquidity they need to do what they need to do. I would also say on the evaluation side of projects, things like that, there's some rigor that we put into place. But it's really on the add-on acquisitions is where our finance comes in. I think the real impact is on the operational stuff that I talked about earlier. That's really where that comes into play. And it's interesting because we're a business that people think is just finance driven. And I think in some levels it's important that it is. But yeah, of course we help, when it comes to accounting, it comes to KPIs, it comes to all those elements, right? We put all those in place, and those are lightly considered finance per se. And we put some finance rigor. We have, financial reporting that we do, monthly, we have quarterly. We put all that discipline in place. But really and truly, I would say probably more than any, an example, maybe in terms of, I would say like one of our companies in Salt Lake, BCG, where we owned a ton of equipment, right? And some equipment we were like, look, this company, in many ways, it was really kind of fascinating because the prior owner collected a lot of, equipment, but a lot of the equipment wasn't put to use, right? So there is a valuation there that we do. And it's like, okay, as part of our plan, does this fit in, not fit in? How do we evaluate it? What do we need in terms of restructuring the balance sheet? We sold some of that equipment. We sold a lot of it, right, to help pay down debt and do that. So those are things that we do. I think that we come in and bring a different perspective and an analysis and an approach that helps that company make those decisions. But in reality, it's like those are the decisions that they weren't thinking. Why are you just hanging on to all these assets? They're not creating any value for you right now.
Yeah.
And so there's a make buy, right? Do we, is this in the plan? Do we want to keep this? We have a whole second line, in one company, a beverage line, right? What do we need this for? We're not using it, right? What do we need to do? Let's unlock some of that, value that's sitting there and recycle that into something that's more cool.
I kind of want to touch on we touched on this a little bit earlier. I want to come back to it. When you're structuring a control buyout, and you want to keep everybody happy, right? You guys obviously need to hit your numbers. You want the folks that are, exiting eventually or now to be happy, and for the employees to be happy. What are some key strategies that you employ to make sure that both the seller and the business itself are going to thrive after that transition?
Yeah, that's the critical piece I alluded to earlier about the communication and the alignment, right? So, when it comes down to what we do presently is we develop during our diligence process what we call a value creation plan. And that plan, is driven primarily by, we start with an investment thesis that we have. We delve into our diligence, and within the diligence comes a lot of things that we find and come up, and out of that usually comes many opportunities. So we build that value creation plan, and that value creation plan is not only built by us, but we try to work hand in hand with the sellers pre-closing with that, right? So in that regard, right, we're trying to get not only the sellers, and to the extent that the sellers bring in, sometimes they don't, sometimes they do, bring in some members of their team. In many cases, they do. And so therefore, we're already engaging with the team, and we're already agreeing on kind of what we need to do going forward and getting their buy-in. And again, back to what I said earlier, and I think this sometimes is the hubris of some people in our industry, is there's so much untapped talent in these small companies that people just don't understand, right? And there's so many different employees. I mean, you may have an AP clerk down there that knows more about where everything's hidden than anybody else in the company. And sometimes you don't know that till you own the company, but there's a lot of information and things that are locked up in these companies. So the idea of bringing them into the mix, obviously it's ownership. Obviously it gives them empowerment because they're part of it. It's engagement. It's all those like kind of buzzwords that they talk about, but it really is true. Bringing them into that process is, I think, critical to what happens post-close, because everyone's on the same page. We know what we're doing and we go forward. It doesn't mean that things don't happen along the way that we have to adjust, but the point is that everyone feels very good about what they're doing. Everyone in that circle, at least, and we try to bring the critical people that we need in that circle to begin with, is an agreement, an understanding about what needs to get done. So we hit the ground running, and everyone's should be on the same page.
I'm sure that some of these companies that you eventually acquire, you were probably in a competitive bid process. There were, I'm sure, other firms that they were considering. The ones that choose you over your competitors, what do you think is the biggest reason they do that?
I think over the years, we used to say, I don't know if it's as true today as it used to be. Let me just say that. But it was really I think we're from Pittsburgh. There's a little element of we're kind of not the Wall Street guys coming in. More often than not, I'm not wearing this. We go see these guys. We're on the plant floor. I learned early in the game. I remember back in the 2005, we were looking at some foundry, and I was wearing really nice clothes, and it looked like Terminator, scene from Terminator in there, and all the ash and all the stuff going on. And I came out of there going, I don't know what I was doing here, but this was silly, right? I learned my lesson. But we go in, and I think I feel authenticity and trust is critical, right? So how do we win? You have to build that trust and that authenticity over time. That's become, over a period of time, that became easier for us because we had a track record, and people could do a background on us. They could talk to former CEOs and say, are these guys for real or not? But I always tried to do, over the time, look for elements where we can build trust. And that means there are times at which there's a point in time in every discussion or conversation or relationship where you have to actually exhibit something that garners that trust, right? And
How
I
do you
think
do that?
we look for that. And so where do you, so there may be an instance where, we had a discussion 3 weeks ago and something had changed. You said, well, you said this and you promised this. And I'm like, you know what? You're right. Let's move on. I'm not going to go back on, this is what we talked about before. This is what we agreed to. Boom. Let's just move forward with it. Right. Or whatever. I mean, that's a silly small example, but it's like, how do you exhibit ways to say I can be trustworthy? So along the way, it's like, how do you win? We used to say it's who you partner with. It's all those things. It's an emotional decision. Do they trust you? Do they trust what you're going to do? And I would say that we built, that's one of probably our, superpower is probably a big term. But as a firm, it's because we're lucky because we've been around for 20 years and we built that reputation. That reputation is very helpful. So when we're in a bid and it's, pretty much on par, where are they going to go, right? And we've won in a few instances over the years. We've not, I think, more often than not historically. That hasn't been the case recently, but more often than not historically, we've not been the highest bidder.
Okay.
And
they're choosing you because they feel more comfortable with you and the direction you're going to take the company, and they trust you. They like you.
Yeah. Again, it's an emotional decision. It's their baby. I think, it's always about the money, right? No matter what they say, at some level, it's about the money. But if on balance, who you want to partner with, particularly if they're going to stick around and play for that second bite at the apple.
You gave sort of what you called that silly small example of, a few weeks later, they're like, oh, hey, wait, you said this. And you're like, okay, yeah, let's go with it. This doesn't need to be an argument here. But I wonder if there are ways, this is the wrong word to use, but I can't think of a better one in the moment, where you can sort of manufacture those opportunities to demonstrate trust, rather than sort of like waiting for something like that to kind of happen. Yeah.
No, and there is. And I look for some of those too. Where can I show, what is it that we're doing? How are we doing it? We're negotiating. And there's some things where we're like, look, all right, I get what you're saying. I mean, there are times when it's clear that, we know and they know. You get towards the end of a deal. Everyone's burnt out. Everyone's tired. You're getting close to getting it closed. The poor seller has been through hell and back. Through a financial and operational audit, no matter what you tell them, they never understand it till you go through it. How difficult of a process it really is, particularly for companies that don't have that infrastructure I talked about. So all the diligence is a lot of work for them, right? And so everyone's fatigued. And so at the end, there are ways to, all right, we're good with this, we're good with that. I'm not going to fight over this. I'm not going to fight over that. And even though we know that we may be in a position of strength towards the end of getting it done, I mean, they're 3 days from saying, I'm going to get the biggest payday of my life. And we're like, well, we're going to walk away from this deal because this doesn't make sense. We can't agree to X, Y, and Z. And you'll find that sometimes there'll be those events too that we're like, you know what? Again, we're in a business. The interesting thing about attorneys and about, structuring deals are, their job is to structure every scenario possible to protect every scenario possible. And what I tell people is that that's impossible. We could iterate all day long. At some point, right? We're in the business of equity. At some point, we have to take some leap that says, all right, there may be a gap here, but we're not going to be able to do this. And I can't spend $5 million trying to legal a deal at that level, which I think has a 0.005% chance of ever occurring. So, you get down to that point oftentimes, but, we're pretty rigorous. We know what the market is. We understand what the terms are that we need to get and what's really important and not important. Sellers, one of the issues, sellers don't really understand that.
They haven't had as much of that experience as you have. This is their first time riding that rodeo. Yeah. Rob, what's for you, whether personal or professional, what's a serious challenge that you've overcome? How'd you get through it? What did you learn?
Yeah, I'd say, probably one of the biggest ones was when I was at Fisher Scientific, I had started up. It was one of these. This is where I started really getting my love of entrepreneurship. I started this. It was basically an eBay for scientific equipment and supplies. At the time, I was the finance manager for the distribution and logistics group for the company. So I think at the time we had like 63 distribution centers throughout the world, and we were having a huge problem. We sold active about 200,000 SKUs, and we had a ton of inactive SKUs, right? It's a big company, covers a lot of bases, and huge amount of what I would consider excess and obsolete inventory in the system. And I was like, how are we going to solve this? And so, I came up with this idea. This is no joke. I was at PitCon, which is a conference, and it's called PitCon, but it was a conference for medical supplies and equipment down in New Orleans. And I don't know why they invite the finance guy. Why am I doing at one of these conferences, right? It's all about sales and the like. I literally hold myself up in the hotel room when I was down there, and I wrote a business plan for what I eventually called Einstein's Garage. And in that process, we developed what I considered, a way to leverage what, Fisher Scientific had, the assets, the distribution assets, the transaction ability and the like. And what I ended up doing was saying, look, we can turn what I guess you would call now is more of a reverse logistics type of situation, but it was an auction business. So create a new website from scratch, did all this. Did the branding.
What year was this? I just want to frame it.
It was like 2000, 1999 timeframe.
Early days. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So it seems a little cliche maybe now, but at the time we had to hire a firm out of, San Francisco to build my auction engine. That's how long ago this was. And so, we built that and it started to move, and it was interesting. And I started thinking outside of just Fisher with this. So I went and talked to AstraZeneca, some of the other major companies, and said, look, we can do this for you too, right? Basically, we set up a system not only to sell the product through the secondary market, but a way, we built a warehouse down in North Carolina, and I said, we can take your excess out of your system, and that stuff that you had actually written off at 100%, we can do some profit recovery for you, right? And so I felt like this was and then, oh, by the way, we can also manage your fixed assets. So if you're AstraZeneca and you have 4 or 5 locations, R&D locations or labs where you have a Beckman centrifuge, that should be listed. That should be on an intranet, on a system that everyone in your organization should be able to access where it is and is it in use or not. And therefore, you may have a lab over here that may need one and wants to buy a new one, but you have one that's idle over here. So why don't we do a holistic asset management program for you? And oh, by the way, if you want to unload it, it's on the system. You let us know. We'll take it down to North Carolina. We'll sell it and we'll get you some.
Sounds like a pretty clever idea, especially for the time frame you're talking about.
Loved it. And then soon as the .com era ended, the company at Fisher was like, we don't want to do this anymore. It's a distraction. they're a multi-billion-dollar company.
Everything internet related felt toxic at that time.
And the whole strategy of the company changed. And so I actually went to them and said, well, can I buy it from you? Because I really believed in it. And they're like, we can't do that. And I get it now that I'm older, I understand. We can't just let an employee buy one of our businesses and go off, right? It's not a good look. But, and so at that point I was like, all right. And my options as I'm going back to being, a, finance person for a division or moving my way back that way. But I had that taste of entrepreneurship that I was like, I can't go back. I don't just want to do that anymore. And that's when I ventured off into Standish Consulting and where I was starting to do that activity-based costing system. And I said, look, I want to start something on my own. And I want to make money. It's like, it kind of demystified things for me. It was very difficult. And by the way, it's a lot easier to do this stuff when you have a big company that's allowing you to do it. So don't get me wrong. I did not go down that route, right? There are a lot of people that
you still got the steady paycheck. They were paying for everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
But a nice way to kind of wet your beak. And it was really, I'm sure, hard and like heartbreaking that this thing that you had built and, were close to really making work. Now you got the rug pulled out from under you.
Got the rug. By the way, we had some issues. It was so funny. We did have some issues with Einstein's, I think we had a little issue with our branding. They were like, hey, you guys are, you can't use Einstein's. And it was Einstein's garage and we had a lab rat. That was our icon, it was our icon. We used it. We had little beanie babies with a lab rat and everything else, but they weren't real thrilled with us using his name in that way. But it
like
was
the Family Foundation or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was interesting, but so all that was, disappointing because I really put a lot into it. And I really felt, which is interesting, I think maybe a little bit ahead of our time. And that I think that whole industry of reverse logistics and some of the things that happened over the ensuing years became real industries, right? That, those were real impactful industries. And we were just a little piece of it. And it was an idea. But unfortunately, I didn't get to see it to fruition.
Well, and that happens, is you've now learned, having been in the venture space and been involved with lots of businesses. I mean, that happens in business, right? You've got these ideas. You're so excited about them. It seems like this has to work and you chase it down and sometimes it doesn't come to fruition. And it's a lot of lost time, sometimes a lot of lost revenue and other resources. So yeah.
Without that, I would not have done what I've done today. So, I mean, the bottom line is all this precursor is just, I always say life is a little bit like, that ball that drops on that pegboard, it's like the peg and you don't know where it's going to end up at the end. And so little ball, I don't know what they call that little thing, but it's like, these are like yes, no decisions or points in your life. And so there's all these permutations at the end where that ball can end up. And it all depends on where you tack when you hit that peg. Are you going this way? Are you going this way? And, that was one of those pegs that pushed me this way, right? That forwarded me on to where I was, got today.
So what's your personal superpower, Rob?
I don't know if I have a real superpower. I mean, I would say, the thing that I feel like has propelled me is one, luckiest man in the world at it. Two, my father's since passed away, but mother and father that were excellent parents. And they didn't go to college, but they instilled in me, I think a lot of the attributes that I think have propelled me, and I would say one of those that's really propelled me is just curiosity. I think if you think about it, people always laugh at me. It's like, God, you want to talk about physics or you want to talk about, you want to talk about health or you want to talk about this and you delve so deeply in it. It has nothing to do with, I'm very, very curious about things. And I think that curiosity, and that willingness to say yes at critical times has been really critical. I've had young people that come to me all the time, like, how'd you get there? How'd you do this? And I look at them like, I'm the last guy you want to talk to because this was not a planned career path for me, right? This was taken
one step at a time.
One step at a time. It was opportunistic and the willingness to take the risk and say yes. When we started this business, Three Rivers Capital, I had 4 children under the age of 7. My wife went back to work, and I would say I'm the luckiest man in the world because I have an amazing, amazing wife that put up with all of this. and allowed me to do this. And I'm sure I'm not alone in many people that would say their spouses were critical. But it was, I went 2 years without making any money getting this started. And, she went back to work and we had the kids and it was just chaos. And man, without that support, it wouldn't have happened. So it's also the second piece of the curiosity. And I would say that determination. I was a wrestler as a kid ever since I was 6 and I always felt like, you learn a lot from that, right? It was a very difficult sport. It was very, and I remember it was just like, it just developed that determination, that fire in your belly. And I think, I don't give up. And I think that, if you're an entrepreneur, I don't care what anyone says. I'm sure there's that anecdote that someone, overnight did this, that, and the other, but hardly anyone ever does that, right? You have to go through hell and back to make the stuff happen. You really do. And you have to have that determination and you have to have that perseverance. And, it's the vision and the belief in yourself, and that vision and that perseverance is really what drives it. And I think more than anything, I would say that those, the curiosity to be willing to learn is critical in our business. It's critical to understand all different aspects of things. You never know, I think, you never know when some element of knowledge or whatever could come be helpful to you. And then that willingness not to give up. That's one of the really, I think, superpowers of our business at 3RC and the culture that we have here is we don't give up. We're very, very, very determined.
That's great stuff. Rob, I've just got one more question for you, but before I ask it, I want to do two things. I'm going to invite all of our listeners to hit the follow button on their favorite podcast app. I've had a great conversation here today with Rob from Three Rivers Capital. I want you guys to continue to get more great content like this in your feed. Rob, I also want to let people know the best way to get in touch with you or continue to follow your story. What would that be?
I think our website and LinkedIn are the easiest ways. We're out there. I would just say that, my name is very unique. Not many of us have Carskadden, or I don't know if you, Anthony, know anyone named Carskadden. But I'm first out there in Three Rivers Capital. So our website, 3RC Cap, Three Rivers Cap.com. The number 3.
The number 3.
Go to our website.
Yeah, and we'll include links in the show notes for everybody to both your website and your LinkedIn profile. So last question for you, Rob. A year from now, you and I reconnect and you're excited and you're celebrating something. What's that thing you're celebrating?
Well, my first grandchild is going to be a year old. I'll be celebrating that. It's an excellent thing to be celebrating, and I'm a new grandparent, so I'm very excited about that. I would say business-wise, I'm looking to probably have a couple exits a year from now. I think we'd be celebrating that. A couple of them we've had a long time. Some of them we've really had to drive, hit some speed bumps during COVID. So, the ability to kind of, that back to what I was saying before about that determination and working through it and seeing to the other side and really making something happen. I think we may be able to see that next year.
Love it. I love that the family was the first answer. Rob, I want to be the first to thank you for sharing both your time and your story with us here on the Inspired Stories podcast. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really appreciate meeting you, Anthony.
Folks, that's a wrap on another episode of the Inspired Stories podcast. Thanks for learning with us today.